Hi, and welcome to Experience Week. We are excited to have you with us today. This presentation is titled From Big Data to Smart Data by Marc Schwartz and Kari Virtanen from Microsoft. Before we jump into content, some quick housekeeping items. First, feel free to share this event with your colleagues. It's not too late to register. Let others know you are watching by tweeting at Qualtrics with #ExperienceWeek. All content from today is available on demand, so enjoy. The time is now yours, Marc and Kari.
Kari and I are super excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about the journey that Microsoft has been on to figure out ways to leverage data. I like this cartoon a lot, where it talks a lot about the power of big data to show trends, but the need for big data to be translated into little data for action. Business today requires data, and there's a lot of it, and it's coming in more and more. When I think about the amount of data that exists now versus 10 years ago, it's an amazing volume of data, but the challenge is how do you take that data and use it in practical ways that can really drive business impact? In our particular space, we work in the research side of Microsoft, that we have multiple surveys that are fielded throughout the globe, and we have multiple data sources that both look at customer actual product usage as well as social data. And the question is, how do you bring all that data together that it becomes a real good asset for the company, but doesn't just stay in the clouds of looking at trends, but looks at ways that we can really use that data. So we're going to be talking today about a couple ways that we at Microsoft have been using big data to transform it into little data for action and usage. That's becoming increasingly important as our stakeholders are wanting data and insight in faster and faster ways. So when our stakeholders, and our stakeholders could be anyone from a product planner to the engineering team who's working on products to our marketers, come to us, they have business questions that need answers. Our traditional ways have been using quant data, relying on any kind of suppliers to do analysis and cutting and recutting of the data, and looking for just ways to get that big data. But the challenge of being able to do it fast, simple, and actionable has really been an ongoing challenge and opportunity for us to think about how do we support the business better. So what we're going to talk to you about today are two ways that we've invested in infrastructure to help approach solving these problems and issues in ways that we have been using big data in unique ways to drive a level of insight from that data that the business has benefited from. My particular area is social intelligence, and I think a way to tell you about what social intelligence is as Microsoft is to tell you more about what we don't do in terms of social intelligence. My team is not responsible for outbound marketing measurement, so I won't necessarily share about likes or share about the number of fans or the engagement on posts. What I'm looking for is to really understand what are conversations happening about Microsoft, about its competitors, about its individual products, and about its individual customers, and how are those individual pieces of insight being used to really drive better engagements with customers. Give you a little sense of how we approach social at Microsoft and how we approach social intelligence. Wanted to first give you some sense of the kind of team we have. So I have a 5-person team that I manage onshore, but then an 18-person team that I manage offshore in India that delivers reports across all of our product lines and across all of our brands in order to be able to measure and manage the day-to-day conversations about our customers. But what we're listening for are anything related to Microsoft, anything related to its key competitors, anything related to the specific sub-brands underneath Microsoft and the competitive set related to that. We tend to also look for very broad topics that we care about. So we have big initiatives with education, for example, and so we look for all education conversations that we and our competitors are a part of to be able to understand. We also look at author-based or site-based to be able to look at what do developers say and think differently than IT pros, differently than SMBs, differently than just consumers. And so we look for all those kinds of conversations, and we look to measure those in very specific ways. One of the ways we look to measure those is through key messages that Microsoft is really caring about. So think about artificial intelligence, think about value. And so we have an ability to be able to do that because we do a lot of work on developing complex queries to be able to gather all of the relevant data from the internet, not just that data that is all generic, but very specific to those things that we're looking for. And we try to look for entities, which are proper names versus a document, which is a full conversation, to really understand what are people saying about Microsoft and what are people saying about competitors individually. And we do that and provide sentiment and provide volume and provide theme analysis in deep ways. So to be able to do that is a complex process. And so what you're seeing on the slide is a little summarization of a complex process where we have relationships with all of the different social data providers. And we've built those individual relationships so that we don't have to deal with sampling, but we can actually get the full data feeds from those. And we take those data and we have to ingest it in a way that can standardize it. And then we have to be able to sift through that data to find what are those data points that are most relevant to the business questions of our stakeholders. Then we put it through a natural language processing to be able to tag it that really will fuel the reporting. When you think about the volume of this data, it becomes a daunting task. So I just pulled 4 different data feeds, and you can see the uniqueness of how those data feeds actually are looking. And the need to take those individual data feeds and bring them together in something that we can use is a daunting task, but one that's really required to be able to have the level of insight around our products and our brands that we need. That process requires us to understand, but then take that data and bring it together in a useful and usable way. That process then has to go through our next phase, which is really being able to tag it for the data that we need. So this particular slide shows one of our complex queries. One of the challenges of dealing with social is that there's so much of it, and how do you know which part of it is relevant and which part of it is not? So we've been working with a team and really helping them learn over the last few years, how do we write the right kinds of complex queries to get to the data that we really need and remove the data that we don't need? So an example, think about Windows and all of the ways that Windows are used in social. I opened the window today. I bought my Windows computer. My window just broke. Of all of those uses of Windows, only one of them is really relevant to me as I do analysis of the Windows 10 product. And the need to be able to do as much exclusions as we do inclusions becomes really important in being able to find that right data. So we spent a lot of time writing complex queries to both include and exclude the right kinds of conversations to be able to make it relevant in the insight that we're going to deliver. Once we have that data tagged, we want to assign sentiment to it. And that sentiment process goes through a natural language engine that we've partnered with. But we've done a lot of customization work, and a lot of that customization work is because of the uniqueness of the technology audiences that we deal with. So think about Windows 10 launch that happened last year. One of the things that was unique is the notion that we had some upgrades that were more forced than just people choosing it because we realized the value of the product. And that word force doesn't necessarily imply negativity, but in the context of what we heard from customers, that was more of a negative term. And so we were able to refine our dictionary to be able to ensure that sentiment was not just a generic view of sentiment, but it was specific to Microsoft and its products. What we've been able to do, though, through all of this kind of data processing is a very deep level of analysis. And I just put a few examples to show you the kinds of analyses that we do. This analysis takes the form of quick real-time analysis that might be fueling the report of an activity that happened that day. So think about last week when Apple made the announcement about their new iPhones. As a competitive brand, we're able to report on that at the moment in a quick kind of turn analysis. We also can do deeper dive analysis where we really look at volume trends, we look at sentiment trends, we look at hashtag activity, but we also take the data and put it through an analysis engine to really look at what are the themes of that analysis. So we've been able to do analysis around a LinkedIn announcement. We've been able to do analysis around Tabot and when artificial intelligence is becoming more part of the conversation. That level of analysis would never be able to be done without being able to parse out the data and really deal with it on a deeper level. So here's an example of just something that we deal with every day. So we walk in on a Monday, and what we deliver on a weekly basis to the business is a newsletter that goes through the master brand, which is Microsoft, its competitors, Apple and Google, and look at what conversations happened from last week to this week, what changed positively, what changed negatively, what changed in volume. And we've been able to take that data and put into a Power BI dashboard that we can do exploration work, we can use to create the newsletter, but even more interestingly, we've been able to give this to our stakeholders so that people can have better access to social data and do their own exploration. It's been super interesting for people to be able to, and you can't really tell on just a slide, but you can click on to any of these different parts of this Power BI dashboard to be able to do a lot of your own self-discovery. Another common scenario is that we see something like a LinkedIn purchase, and we want to know deeper about that. So we've also provided an opportunity through a UI interface that goes directly to our social data to be able to go into that particular conversation and slice it and dice it. The chart that you see on the top right is all of the main themes, not just the main topics, but the main themes that we're coming across around LinkedIn. And then you could even deep dive on the sub-themes. This becomes really important for us as we think about how to deal with social data and the bigness of social data. The 1.5 to 2 million documents we bring in every day has to be processed. And so here's one way that Microsoft has been doing it. But there's other ways. So let me turn it over to Kari to talk about other ways that we've been doing it.
Thank you, Marc. So in this next section, we are going to discuss first in general how the market researcher might see the data landscape around him or her evolving or changing. Then we're going to show a few case examples how we at Microsoft are tackling some of these changing needs. So when you start to look from the helicopter perspective, so the world today might actually look very simple. So on one hand, you have the sort of a standard survey type of a data with thousands of rows for respondents, and depending on the complexity of your survey, hundreds if not thousands of columns unique responses. And you typically receive this data file from your agency, either SPSS file or CSV file or similar type of a data file. Then on the other hand, a little bit depending on which line of a business you are in, you may have access to transactional or the behavioral data, however you want to call it. Typically, it's a raw, almost log type of a data file with timestamps for different certain events and whether certain purchases were made from your website or what the machines you have access to are trying to tell you. So far, pretty straightforward survey type of a data and then more machine-generated transactional data. It's only when you start thinking about these different dimensions, things may get slightly hairier. Your data may come in a structured form in terms of like closed questionnaires or where there's a clearly defined fields and potential values, or as a sort of like a typically how the transactional data is. Or then it can be unstructured, like the social data Marc was just describing, or then the pre-text entries and all other kinds of verbatims that you may have access to. So data can be small in terms of a size, either a couple of 100 kilobytes of a survey data from dozens of respondents, or then the totally other extreme when you really need to have a systems in place to process terabytes, if not petabytes of a social or telemetry kind of a data. The complexity also determines how you may want to process the data. Some tracker monsters that may have like dozens of different modules and super complex routing schemes, or then just like a single purpose smaller survey. Also the cadence that may further increase the difficulty, especially if you sort of feel every week and make constant changes to the questionnaire. You needing to maintain trends, recalculate a whole lot of things, re-baselining, whatever, versus then for the one-offs or once a year type of studies like a segmentation studies. For sure, there are other dimensions like for quality and processing time, etc. And finally, add to the mix the actual context where the sort of typical market researcher today often operates. Especially in the larger organization, you are at the same time blessed, but also cursed with so many different data sources. On one hand, you have primary research, you have secondary research, and ever-increasing amount of telemetry and other sources alike. Then, obviously, you need to sort of turn around these KPIs quicker and quicker. And then, even though the whole volume and cadence and requirement for faster delivery increases, obviously you cannot sacrifice the quality. Oftentimes, you may actually sort of need to go back to the drawing board and sort of perhaps sort of rethink how the sort of a whole data process goes from the upstream from your vendor, then to the downstream to the sort of reports and insights that are eventually generated. And to cater for the sort of a volume of the data and the different kinds of the data, then you need to throw into sort of all sorts of manual and automated checks when you are processing and putting the data out there then for your end users. So, and obviously, if this wasn't enough, you can also cross the line, obviously, then what comes to the privacy and other regulations, depending on the industry and depending on the country that you operate. So if there's one takeaway from this section, it could be that today's really fast-changing world, regardless of the industry you are in, these different kinds and types of data just become more and more. And even though they pose a whole lot of new possibilities for generating better insights, but there's also sort of a new requirements then in terms of like skill set for the sort of a average market research or the normal market researcher, and how to think about the way you process the data and what type of sort of infrastructures you may want to deploy. Okay, next I will briefly cover 3 examples of different ways how we at Microsoft go about some of these new needs for data processing. The first example is how we approach real-time satisfaction measurement in several product categories, whether it's hardware products or whether it's an application or the software releases. So the initial need here really came from the fact that we really, as we are launching so many different applications, software releases, products, etc. So it became sort of impossible to sort of get a really good understanding right when the sort of these new products applications were hitting the market. So how customers are perceiving them. Historically, there's been a sort of a mechanism in place in the telemetry area where that were sort of more focused on the R&D and around the software performance and software quality. And obviously those ones were not really geared for understanding the customer perception. And obviously, we then also relied on, let's say, the primary research, but it typically took weeks, if not then months, to get a sort of first read from the market, so how customers are perceiving our products. Then what we did was that we actually implemented then across the different touch points really super simple questionnaire. In some cases it's NPS, in some cases it's a product satisfaction question. So one score and then the sort of verbatim to go along with. And it was a great fit because it really satisfied all the business requirements shown on the slide here. However, determining the metric really was only the first part of the journey. And in order then to be able to cater for collecting tens of thousands of these unique responses on a daily basis, it was really pivotal to have the right foundation and the sort of data infrastructure to go along with that. In order to fully optimize for the volume of the data and across, again, there's so many different touch points, there were also additional requirements that need to be taken into account. For instance, so how do you process the free text answers? How do you translate from one country to, from one language to another language? What type of reporting systems you have then placed for the sort of always up-to-date, easily accessible reports? What types of analysis practices and insights you want to then bring to your stakeholders? Target setting, feedback loop, all these things. So these requirements then eventually enabled us to understand how complex our data modeling would need to be, even though the question itself was super simple. And also all those building blocks that were needed to bring this to life, whether it was from the data ingestion, ETL part of the process, or whether it was analysis and then the sort of the reporting end. So in the end of the day, and today, we are receiving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of responses on a daily basis, which we are automatically translating using Bing. All the KPIs are automatically processed, and the main dashboards and reports are updated real-time fashion. And we are providing this for a whole lot of different parts of the company, whether it's R&D teams working on a specific application or the device, or whether it's marketing folks thinking about how the marketing messages have been landed, how the KPI is perceived, or whether it's upper management, then perhaps more from the KPI perspective. The second example illustrates how we are tackling many of the complexities mentioned earlier. So these different kinds of data sets, need for quick turnaround of highest quality, yet a system and a process that allows us then to easily add new data sources, and all this obviously then with the most cost-efficient way. In our case, obviously we didn't have a choice, but more of a luxury to use our own latest and greatest technologies, and for us it was really sort of a dog fooding to the most extreme. It was also paramount for us so that we would own the whole IP, not just the raw data asset itself, but also how the logic is being then applied to the raw data. So what weights to put in, so how to, and all those hundreds of different business rules that you need to have in place to calculate the needed KPIs. And additionally, as now all the key research assets sit on the same platform, it really allows us then to create this sort of fully optimized process end-to-end. Data structures, the data models, and we can easily apply them now across our whole research portfolio. So here in this slide is sort of a really basic structure and very high-level overview of the data supply chain, if you will. And this is especially geared for survey data, but this truly is sort of flexible and nimble enough to support also telemetry and other types of volumes of the data, as also earlier discussed. So it starts from data intake, data ingestion, And there a sort of a typical scenario is that an agency drops a new data file into our Azure blob storage, out of which then the data is automatically fetched. Or if it's like a more telemetry, continuous type of a data stream, so there are also APIs that sort of connect directly to our platform. So what happens next? So we basically sort of bring up R and execute all the sort of a business rule calculation and some of those automated quality checks. Why we chose R? So R was chosen because of its sort of a flexibility in terms of inputs and outputs. It was also like a platform independent, so it runs on your laptop or it runs on the cloud. It was scalable and performant enough for our purposes. And also another sort of a neat thing here was the sort of the overall version control. So we are always able to go back in time and see how a sort of a particular KPI, the metric was calculated in the first place. And it's really transparent. So there's no like black box in a sense of how we bring up then the sort of KPI for the company. So, okay, so now we process the data using R, then we load it to SSAS, then for reporting purposes. And we have today, we feature like a 3 distinct interfaces or the tool sets then for accessing and analyzing the data. So Power BI, so that serves as like the sort of our default canvas, if you will, for all the research data that we are processing and hosting. Well, it's easy to use. It has all the basic filtering and analytical capabilities, and today it's also possible to include your own R scripts directly into the dashboard. So it's also quite neat feature in there. And it very nicely complements, obviously, then the sort of a standard PowerPoint deliverables that we still do, but in sort of many cases, we are not anymore producing, let's say, the standard PowerPoints, but rather than sort of rely completely on this sort of a dashboard for the key data deliveries. Then, as a second category, so we still use, obviously, Excel. That is then more for complex data exploration or analytics needs, and especially use cases where the sort of like higher data density typically is required. And obviously sort of everybody knows Excel, so it's very easy and for a lot of people then to use. Then in addition to Power BI and Excel, we also built sort of a custom tools. You use various technologies such as D3, and those custom data applications, if you will, typically are such kinds that combine data from multiple sources and are really sort of specifically built to answer a certain use case or give a user only certain ways to sort of manipulate the data. And they are typically used for like a visually appealing data application or the data babies, if you will. Moving on. The last example very much builds on the previous example, and it's a kind of a natural offspring or successor. So it's built on the fact that now that we have all these key research assets running on the same platform, and this is truly designed to solve the need for quicker, standardized, let's say more advanced analytical runs. So we realized that quite often we tend to spend, well, time and money to crank out those same yet elaborate driver, etc. analysis when we get to sort of a new data. That process typically took a couple of weeks, perhaps in some cases even a month, and we were just doing the same analysis over and over again. So now sort of we are implementing for some of our key assets, and when applicable, like defaulting few key machine learning methods, those of which then our research managers can then execute on the fly when we've got the new data refreshed for that specific asset. And this obviously sort of saves us a lot of time and energy, and sort of we can sort of focus on, let's say, more bespoke analytical problems, or then just move on. And again here, it's been a quite perfect combination R and Azure and this was fairly simple to build and from the scratch. It took a couple of months actually to sort of get this up and running. So hopefully, this gave us sort of a glimpse of some of the potentially different ways to think about some of the data collection and data processing methods, from anything from survey data to telemetry, and also then sort of the possibilities that the new technology here today then may enable.
Thanks, Kari. So we've been learning a lot through this journey. We have not tread on this journey lightly, and as you can see, there's been a lot of different investments that have been made to build out the infrastructure. There's, I think, three main lessons we've learned about the investments. I think the first one is that we really need to find the right people who can innovate within this big data space and making it something usable. That the challenge of using big data to become small data for action has a bit of an art and a science to it. The science obviously is how do you take and transpose data and use it in meaningful ways, but the art is the creativity of how to do that. I think Kari's examples are really great of creative infrastructure to create scale. And so I think one of the things that we've been playing with is our job descriptions and looking for as much diversity of talent as we can find, diversity of experience, diversity of industry, diversity of thinking process, but diversity of data experiences so that people can really innovate. A second thing that we've been learning is about finding the right technology to support your business. We built a social intelligence tool from scratch. At the same time, we constantly stay on top of what the industry is building and would just as quickly go to our pre-built model if it could fulfill all of our IP requirements. So finding the right technology is not something that just happens now. It's something that has to constantly change as the ecosystem changes. So finding the right technology to invest in and then being open to what the industry is doing is really important. And then finally, establishing a process that not just collects data but uses it. Data can only be an asset if it is deployed, and figuring out how to deploy it to the right people that goes beyond just reporting to real action and usage is something really important for you to consider. So when we think about the totality of where we are, we feel like we're just at the beginning parts of a journey. That data will continue to multiply, and it's the question of how we can figure out ways to leverage that data to really drive better decision making at all levels within Microsoft, at the most senior level to the most junior research manager trying to learn about what the customers are saying. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate the opportunity to share some of Microsoft's story.
Thanks, Kari and Marc. That was fantastic. And thank you to all of you for joining today. Tune in for the rest of Experience Week for more great content.